the European Parliament. The European Parliament has always been, unlike many international organizations, a very combative and clear-cut institution that clearly understood both the essence of Russia and the futility of any hopes to reform Russia. To a large extent, this understanding was hammered into the minds of the European parliamentarians, first and foremost by the MP Oncharenko. And in general, very clear-headed people have gathered there. But now, somehow, the good Russians have made their way into the European Parliament. And now they will start pushing their agenda there, howling at the great European moon, spouting naive nonsense about a future free and happy Russia. In other words, Yashin, Murza, and others have once again appointed themselves as leaders of the Russian opposition in exile. And in this capacity, they will now lecture the European Parliament about life. Their self-appointment, of course, has understandably provoked the fury of all the immigrant anti-Putin forces who have not delegated any authority whatsoever to either Murza or Yashin. But this anger, these righteous protests have, let's say, remained scattered across numerous different channels and have not received the proper resonance. But really, at this point, it's time to bury this grave, because the Russian opposition is something we can long since forget about. Yes, these are not the worst people, and there are wonderful individuals among the so-called good Russians, but they are all still lost in absurd dreams. They keep cooing that it's all Putin's fault, and the Russian people have nothing to do with it. And the reason for this whining, is absolutely clear. Because Yashin and others like him imagine themselves to be politicians. And they are preoccupied with maintaining a connection to their imaginary electorate. They are hoping to win in some imaginary fair elections in Russia and are afraid to burn bridges with any radical, honest remarks that might upset their future voters. But the naivety of this isn't even worth discussing. And instead of preparing pace the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe or for the need to think tough thoughts there, instead of preparing for the dismantling of Russia, instead of fostering the understanding that the current state of the Russian Federation is in fact its true, natural, and most comfortable state. Well, now these good Russians in the European Parliament will be drooling their rosy spits and confusing the Euroheads, throwing everyone there off track. Although it's clear that, well, as we can see, they occasionally gather somewhere, and for a couple of days, the good Russians use imaginary jigsaws to cut out the outlines of a happy and free country from imaginary plywood. And as a rule, they don't dare to paint their crafts. So basically, they can really be forgotten because the war has allowed us to get to know Russia in a way that no one ever has before. And to ignore common sense, the knowledge we've gained, and a sense of historical perspective would probably be inexcusable at this point. We shouldn't think that all these so-called good Russians are the main ones who missed that great opportunity that Russia once had. Because truly, during the times of the Bolotnaya protests and mass marches, the need for revolution was enormous. And while the danger wasn't yet obvious, it was already being felt. And then the worst thing that could possibly happen occurred. At that point, the revolution was completely taken over and privatized by good people. Truly good people. But being good is absolutely not what is needed in such a situation. Yes, that's why everything collapsed, because it was precisely they who were steering the process. Good people do not make revolutions. The so-called good, law-abiding, cultured, romantic type is simply unfit to be a revolutionary. Only a self-obsessed sadist, a fanatic of the Savonarola or Trotsky variety, can be a revolutionary. But the protesters back then were typically not the kind of people who should have been leading these processes. Yes, and this applies to absolutely everyone. That's why hopes for change in Russia, hopes for overthrowing Putin and changing the political course were lost back then. Yes, revolution is an extremely unpleasant thing. It is always turmoil, it is blood, it is civil war, it is an infant floating in blood. Yes, let's not pretend that it's not true. But my dear friends, everything has its price. And revolution also has its cost. Just like everything in the world. Well, you can't buy a bottle of Camel cognac for 5 kopecks. And it's exactly the same story with a very high cost, including the cost in blood and tears of revolution. But as we can see, we have tears and blood and shame and the threat to the whole world only because at one time, having real protests and a lot of illusions, it all just turned into mere entertainment and an attraction on the streets of Moscow. In general, is the Russian people even capable of revolution? Are they revolutionary? He is quite capable. He demonstrates anger and mobility. We see that he shows an easy willingness to die. For most, there is nothing to lose except a barrack with a netted latrine. Most have neither dreams nor hopes. That is, in theory, the Russian people are actually quite capable of revolution. But right now, in the year 2025, they have no reason for a revolution. They will not rise up. He really likes what is happening, even though on the surface, it all seems quite ugly. Nevertheless, the people have settled in and have felt they've found a certain sweetness, so to speak, in the filth in which they now live, thanks to Putin.